On our 45th wedding anniversary, my husband stood up at our celebration dinner and announced he was divorcing me. Our 2 sons applauded. I'm Linda Montgomery. I'm 65 years old. I placed my ring on the table and said, "All right, Richard, but first there's something these boys should know about their father." Then I looked at the man standing in our garden, the man who'd been watching through the window for the past 20 minutes, the man nobody had invited. Let me start from the beginning. The engagement ring on my left hand felt like it was burning into my skin that November evening. 45 years of marriage. The inscription inside read November 18th, 1979, the date a 20-year-old college student agreed to save her dying mother by marrying a man she didn't love. I sat at the head table of the Montgomery Estate's grand ballroom, my back straight, chin raised, hands folded in my lap the way Richard had taught me. "A Montgomery wife maintains composure," he'd said during our first year of marriage. "Especially you, Linda. People are always watching." He meant white people were watching his black wife, making sure I was respectable enough for their social circle. The ballroom was drowning in white lilies, Richard's mother's favorite, not mine. Their heavy scent mixed with the salt air drifting through the partially open terrace doors. Beyond those doors, I could see the Atlantic Ocean, dark and restless. For our 150 guests, this party represented success, the Montgomerys' 45-year marriage, a triumph of love and commitment. For me, it smelled like a tomb I'd been sealed inside for 45 years. I swept my gaze across the room. Charleston's elite filled every table. Richard's business partners from Montgomery Development Corporation. Old family friends, though they were Richard's friends, never mine. City councilmen, the mayor, even 2 journalists Richard had personally invited to document this milestone of family values. They all drank Richard's expensive champagne. They toasted to loyalty and love. They admired how we'd made it work despite the challenges. That was their polite way of referring to our interracial marriage in 1979, Charleston, South Carolina. "What a remarkable couple," I heard a woman whisper at the next table. 45 years, and look how devoted Richard is. Linda is so lucky." Lucky. I almost laughed. My gaze shifted to Richard. At 67, he looked distinguished. Silver hair perfectly styled. A Tom Ford suit that probably cost $6,000. I knew because I'd picked it up from the tailor last week. He laughed at something his business partner said, throwing his head back slightly. I knew that laugh. It was the laugh of a man who believed the world revolved around him. The laugh of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. 45 years. I'd spent 45 years saying, "Yes, Richard, of course, Richard, you're right, Richard." I'd been his shadow, his proof of diversity, his evidence that he was one of the good ones, a progressive white man who married a black woman. I looked at my sons. Devin, 44, sat to his father's right. Brandon, 42, sat beside him. Both wore expensive suits. Both had Richard's confident posture, his slight smirk, his way of looking at people like they existed to serve him. But they didn't have Richard's gray eyes. They had warm brown eyes. They didn't have Richard's pale skin or thin lips or narrow nose. They had my skin, a beautiful deep brown. They had fuller features. They had my father's strong jaw. No, not my father's jaw. James Patterson's jaw. A memory hit me, sharp and painful. Devin at 3 years old, running through this very ballroom. He'd knocked over one of Richard's golf trophies. Richard hadn't asked questions. He'd simply backhanded me across the face. "That's what you get for not watching him," he'd said. Then he'd walked away to take a business call. I'd cleaned up the broken glass with blood dripping from my split lip. I'd covered the bruise with makeup. I'd smiled at dinner guests that same evening and laughed at Richard's jokes. I thought I was protecting my boys. I thought by taking Richard's anger, I was shielding them from harm. Instead, I taught them that women, that their mother, deserved to be treated like property. The waiters began distributing champagne flutes for the main toast. The room quieted. The string quartet stopped playing. Everyone turned toward our table, expectant. Richard stood slowly. He took the microphone from the bandstand, smiled at the crowd, and began. Dear friends, his voice filled every corner of the room. Years of boardroom presentations had taught him how to command attention. 45 years, nearly half a century. That's a long time to be married to anyone. Polite laughter rippled through the audience. Many of you spoke tonight about patience, about sacrifice, about compromise. He paused, looking around the room. About how important it is to preserve the family. I felt something tighten in my chest. A cold warning. Richard's smile changed. It became harder, colder. I listened to all of your speeches and I thought, he paused for effect. Why? Why do we waste our one precious life trying to meet other people's expectations? The room went silent. Confused glances were exchanged. I've given everything to this marriage, Richard continued. His tone had shifted entirely. I built Montgomery Development from the ground up. I provided this house, this lifestyle, this social standing. Linda was... He made a vague gesture in my direction without looking at me. A good companion. Reliable. My heart started pounding. I knew where this was going. But at 67 years old, I've realized something. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of living in the past. I want to spend whatever years I have left being honest, feeling alive. He paused, then delivered the blow. Therefore, tonight, on this significant anniversary, I want to make an important announcement. He turned to face me directly for the first time. Linda, I'm filing for divorce. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. Someone's fork clattered against a plate. A woman gasped, but Richard wasn't finished. My attorney has already prepared the papers. I've met someone who understands me, someone who makes me feel young again. He gestured toward a young woman in a champagne-colored dress standing near the bar. This is Amber Rodriguez, my executive assistant. We've been together for 2 years. Amber smiled nervously and gave a small wave. I sat perfectly still. The shock wasn't that Richard wanted a divorce. I'd been waiting for that for years. The shock was that he'd chosen to do this here, publicly, in front of 150 witnesses. He'd turned our anniversary party into his personal stage for humiliation. I waited for someone to object, for one of Richard's so-called friends to tell him this was inappropriate, cruel. Instead, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Applause. I turned my head slowly to the right. Devin and Brandon were standing. They were clapping. There was no shock on their faces, no sympathy for their mother, no anger at their father's public betrayal. They were smiling. Finally, Dad, Devin said loudly, raising his glass. It's about time you chose happiness. Seriously, Brandon added, no more pretending, no more obligations to the past. The way he said the past, he meant me. I was the past, the obligation, the burden their father was finally free of. Other guests, seeing the son's reaction, began applauding uncertainly. Some even cheered. Richard nodded to his sons with satisfaction, then sat down and drained his champagne glass. He didn't look at me once. Brandon leaned close to my ear. I could smell expensive cologne and cognac on his breath. Well, Mom, he whispered, and there was venom in his voice. Finally, we don't have to keep pretending we respect you. You were just a diversity hire. Dad's told us the truth. We know you never really worked. You never contributed anything. You just existed. His words hit me like physical blows. These were my babies. The boys whose scraped knees I'd bandaged. The boys I'd read bedtime stories to. The boys I'd protected from their father's coldness by absorbing his cruelty myself. They weren't just betraying me, they were enjoying it. I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. My legs shook, but I forced myself to walk. Not run. Running would show defeat. But walk, slowly, maintaining what dignity I had left. I walked through the ballroom, past the staring faces, past the whispers rising like a wave behind me, past Richard, who'd already turned his attention to Amber, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle. I pushed open the heavy glass terrace doors and stepped into the November night. The Atlantic wind hit my face immediately, cold and sharp and clean. Here, in the darkness, away from the crystal chandeliers and fake smiles, I finally let myself breathe. My hands gripped the stone parapet so tightly my knuckles went white. The first sob tore from my chest with a sound like something breaking inside me. I wasn't crying about the divorce. The divorce was freedom. I was crying for 45 years I'd sacrificed. For the 20-year-old girl I'd been, Linda Washington, with dreams of teaching literature, who loved poetry and believed in love. The girl who'd met James Patterson in the university library and fallen in love with his gentle hands and quiet voice. The girl I'd killed to become Mrs. Richard Montgomery. Mama's dying, Linda. Cancer, stage 4. We can't afford treatment. That's what my mother's doctor had said in September 1979. $847,000 for the clinical trial. It's her only chance. 2 weeks later, Richard Montgomery Sr., Richard's father, had made me an offer. Marry my son. Give us a grandchild. In return, we pay all medical expenses for your mother, plus $200,000 in a trust for her care. Why? I'd asked. My son needs a wife, specifically a black wife. We're expanding business into government contracts, affirmative action requirements. Having an interracial family will open doors. I was a business transaction, a diversity checkbox, and I'd said yes. James had begged me not to do it. We'll find another way, Linda. We'll manage. Don't sell yourself. But I'd been 20 years old, terrified and desperate. I'd chosen my mother's life over my own happiness. Another sob racked my body. I slid down to the cold terrace floor, my expensive dress dragging on the stone. I didn't care. I did this to myself, I whispered into the darkness. I created these monsters. Devin and Brandon learned from watching Richard treat me like property. They learned that money and status matter more than love or respect. I taught them that by staying silent. The wind whipped around me, but I no longer felt cold. Something else was building inside me. Something hard and clear and absolutely done with silence. I stood up slowly, using the parapet for support. My legs didn't shake anymore. My head cleared. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass door. An old woman with smeared makeup and red eyes. But those eyes weren't afraid anymore. I lowered my gaze to my hand. The gold ring gleamed dully in the moonlight. You want freedom, Richard? I said quietly to my reflection. You'll get it, but not the kind you're expecting. I realized I could no longer protect the lie. This family, this legacy, this Montgomery dynasty, it was all built on sand. And if Richard wanted to destroy it publicly, then I'd show him what the foundation was really made of. I took a deep breath, straightening my shoulders. I felt strange, like I'd died and been reborn in the same moment. Then I noticed something in the garden below. A man stood among the sculpted hedges, hands in the pockets of an old jacket. He wasn't looking at the lit windows of the ballroom where the party continued. He was looking up, at the terrace, at me. My heart stopped. James Patterson. He hadn't been on the guest list. Nobody had invited him. But he was here. After 45 years, he was still here. The only person who'd ever seen the real me. The only person who'd never asked me to be anything other than myself. He stood in the shadows, patient and steady, the way he'd always been. I turned away from the railing and walked back toward the ballroom doors. But I wasn't returning as a victim. I was returning as a woman who'd finally decided to tell the truth, whatever the cost. I pushed open the ballroom doors with both hands. The sharp sound of wood hitting the stoppers made several heads turn toward me. I walked differently now. No more shuffling. No more making myself small. Each step was deliberate, my heels striking the parquet floor like a judge's gavel. The room buzzed with gossip. Guests had broken into small groups, hungrily dissecting the scandal. Some shook their heads with manufactured sympathy. Others openly gloated, already calculating how this divorce would affect Richard's business relationships. But when they saw me returning, conversations died. I walked through that gauntlet of eyes without lowering my head. without hiding my tear-stained face. I had nothing left to hide. Not anymore. Richard stood near the bar with Amber, whispering something that made her laugh. She was young, maybe 28, with perfectly straightened hair and a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When she saw me approaching, her laughter stopped. Something in my face made her step back. Devin and Brandon stood nearby, drinks in hand, watching their father with admiration. "Oh, she's back," Devin said loudly to his brother, not even trying to lower his voice. "Here comes Act 2, the tears, the begging. I gave you the best years of my life." Brandon chuckled. "Let her get it out of her system. Maybe we should call her a car. She looks terrible." I heard every word. Before tonight, those comments would have shattered me. Now they bounced off like rain on stone. I walked directly to the head table. Richard turned, irritation crossing his face. "Linda, don't make a scene," he hissed. "Everything's decided. My attorneys will contact you Monday morning. Go home. Sleep it off." Amber stared at me with cold calculation, assessing her rival. But there was no fear in her eyes. Why would there be? I was just the old wife being replaced. I didn't respond to Richard. Instead, I slowly raised my left hand. My fingers grasped the gold wedding band. After 45 years, it had grown into my skin, but now it slid off easily, as if it wanted to leave. The room went completely silent. I placed the ring on the white tablecloth directly in front of Richard's champagne glass. The gold struck the fabric with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the stillness. Richard frowned at the ring. "What's this? Some dramatic gesture? Keep it. Pawn it when you run out of money." He smirked, "which should be in about 6 months, given your spending habits." Devin and Brandon snickered. I looked up. When I spoke, my voice didn't tremble. It filled the space, strong and clear. "Clap louder, boys." They stopped laughing. "Clap for your father. You're so proud of him. So supportive." I paused, looking at each of them. "But before you celebrate too much, there's something you should know about your real father." Devin's smile froze. "Mom, what are you—" "Your real father is standing right there." I didn't point. I just shifted my gaze toward the terrace doors. Through the glass, barely visible in the garden lights, stood James Patterson. The silence that followed was absolute. So complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Richard's face went white, then red, then white again. Devin and Brandon turned to look. Their faces registered confusion, then shock. "Mom, are you drunk?" Brandon asked, but his voice cracked. Fear had entered it. "What the hell are you talking about?" "James," I called out, my voice steady. "Would you come inside, please?" The terrace door opened. James Patterson walked into the ballroom. He was 66 now, wearing a simple gray suit that had seen better days. His hands were weathered from a lifetime of outdoor work. His hair had gone completely gray. But his eyes, those warm amber-brown eyes, were the same ones I'd fallen in love with 45 years ago. He walked through the crowd calmly. People parted before him without knowing why. He didn't look angry or triumphant. He just looked tired, like a man who'd carried a heavy weight for decades and could finally set it down. He stopped beside me, shoulder to shoulder. He didn't touch me, didn't take my hand, just stood there, present, real. For the first time in 45 years, I wasn't alone. Devin found his voice first. He stepped forward, fists clenched. "Mother, have you lost your mind? You brought this stranger here to embarrass Dad? What kind of insane accusation?" "Look at him, Devin," I interrupted quietly. "Really look at him." Devin stared at James. Then something shifted in his eyes. Recognition. Horror. "Look in a mirror," I continued. "Then look at James. Look at the shape of your eyes, your jaw, your hands. Now look at Richard." Brandon moved closer, studying James's face. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It was undeniable. The same deep brown eyes, the same broad cheekbones, the same height and build, the same way of standing, weight slightly on the left foot. "This is ridiculous." Devin said, but his voice had lost its confidence. This is some kind of DNA tests. We need DNA tests. We can do that. James spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, calm. But you already know the truth, son. You've always known something didn't fit. Brandon's face had gone gray. It's a lie. This can't be real. Then Richard laughed. It was a harsh barking sound that made everyone in the room flinch. He laughed and laughed, gripping the table for support. "Oh, this is perfect," he gasped between laughs. Finally! Finally! We stopped pretending. I felt the ground shift under my feet. This wasn't the reaction I'd expected. Richard wiped his eyes, still chuckling. "You thought this was your big revelation, Linda? Your weapon?" He looked at Devin and Brandon, then at the frozen guests. "I've known since the day Devin was born." "What?" I whispered. "Of course I knew." Richard's voice was cold now, all laughter gone. "November 12th, 1980. Devin was born with brown eyes, dark skin, broad features. In my family, everyone is born with gray eyes. It's genetic. Documented in our family history going back 6 generations. He pointed at James. "And this gardener was always hanging around the university where you worked, Linda. Always watching you. You think I'm stupid?" "Then why?" Brandon started. "Why did I keep quiet for 44 years? Richard interrupted. He poured himself more champagne, his hand completely steady. "Because it was profitable." The room seemed to tilt. "My father's will had a clause," Richard continued. "If I divorced before our 50th wedding anniversary, I'd lose the family trust. All of it. $300 million. He smiled. "But he died last year. The trust is now mine, free and clear. So now, I don't need to pretend anymore." Devin stared at his father, the man he'd called Dad for 44 years, with absolute horror. "You knew we weren't yours? You raised us knowing we were another man's children?" "I needed heirs," Richard said simply, as if discussing a stock purchase. "I needed the image of a stable family for business. Investors love a devoted family man. Plus, your grandfather, Linda's father, gave such a generous dowry when we married. $847,000. Exactly what we needed to save Montgomery Development from bankruptcy." He turned to me. "But here's the truth, Linda. You weren't some noble martyr. You stayed with me for the exact same reason I stayed with you. Money, status, security." His words hit me like a slap because there was truth in them. "In 1979, you were a black girl from the poor side of town with a dying mother and no options," Richard continued ruthlessly. "I offered you a way out of poverty. You took it. You traded love for comfort, for this house, for the Montgomery name. We're the same, Linda. We both sold our souls. I'm just honest about it." I looked at James. He stood quietly, pain in his eyes, but no judgment. He'd known, he'd understood, and he'd waited anyway. Richard was right. I had been afraid. Not just for my mother. I'd been afraid of being poor, of being judged, of struggling. I'd chosen the golden cage. But there was one thing Richard didn't know. "You're right," I said quietly. "I was afraid. I made choices out of fear, but Richard, you forgot something important." "What's that?" He took a sip of champagne, confident he'd won. "This house, this estate, the land. Who do you think owns it?" His smile faltered slightly. "I do. Obviously." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder. "Thomas Hartley, could you join us, please?" A gray-haired man in his 60s stood up from one of the back tables. Thomas Hartley, our family attorney for 30 years. He'd been sitting quietly, watching everything. He walked to the head table carrying his own briefcase. "Mr. Montgomery," Thomas said formally, "I need to remind you of something you seem to have forgotten. This estate, the house, the land, all 37 acres, was gifted to Mrs. Linda Montgomery by your father, Charles Montgomery Sr., on June 15th, 1985. "That's impossible," Richard started. Thomas opened his briefcase and pulled out documents. "Property deed, filed with Charleston County, 847 Ocean View Drive. Sole owner, Linda Washington Montgomery. Your father was protecting family assets from your business creditors. He feared you'd gamble everything away. He placed the deed on the table. Official, notarized, undeniable. Richard's face went from red to white to purple. But the company, Montgomery Development, that's mine. The accounts, 51% voting shares transferred to Mrs. Montgomery on March 3, 1998, Thomas continued, pulling out more papers. When you defaulted on $12 million in business loans, your father arranged the transfer to protect the company from creditors. Mrs. Montgomery has been the majority shareholder for 26 years. Brandon grabbed the documents, reading frantically. His hands shook. All these years, Devin's voice was barely a whisper. We thought Dad was the successful one, the provider. But it was Mom. Your mother's inheritance from Charles Sr. was $73 million, Thomas said. Richard received $5 million. The rest of the Montgomery fortune went to Linda with instructions to protect it from my foolish son's business mistakes. I watched Richard's world crumble. Everything he'd built his identity on, the successful businessman, the Montgomery patriarch, the provider, all of it was a lie. He'd been living in my house, running my company, spending my money. For 45 years. Amber took one look at Richard's devastated face and quietly picked up her purse. She walked toward the exit without a word. She hadn't signed up for a broke old man with nothing to offer. Amber, Richard called after her. Amber, wait. The door closed behind her. She didn't look back. Richard turned to me, desperation replacing arrogance. Linda, please. We can discuss this. 45 years. You have 72 hours to remove your belongings from my house, I said clearly. After that, I'll have you removed as a trespasser. You can't do this. He grabbed my arm. James stepped forward, placing himself between us. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Richard's hand dropped. I looked at my sons. They stood there, everything they'd believed about themselves shattered. Devin, Brandon, you're adults. You have your own apartments, your own cars. You'll be fine. But I will not allow people who applauded my humiliation to remain in my home. Mom, please, Brandon started. I gave you 44 years of love, I said. I protected you. I sacrificed for you. I taught you wrong by staying silent about your father's cruelty. That's my failure, and I'm sorry for it. But you're grown men now. What you do with this truth, that's your choice. I turned to James. Let's go. I need some air. We walked toward the exit together, not touching, just walking side by side. Behind us, Richard's voice rose. You'll regret this, Linda. I'll sue. I'll fight this. The ballroom doors closed, cutting off his threats. Outside, the November wind was cold and clean. For the first time in 45 years, I felt like I could breathe. Thank you for coming, I said to James quietly. I read about the party in the newspaper, he said. Something told me you might need a witness. I almost smiled. You always knew, didn't you, that tonight was the night? I hoped. After 45 years, Linda, I just hoped. We stood in the parking lot, two people in their 60s, finally free from their respective prisons. What happens now? I asked. Now? James looked at me with those steady amber eyes. Now you go home, your home, and you start living your life, the one you should have had all along. And you? I'll be here, in Charleston, if you need me. He smiled slightly. I'm pretty good at waiting. I watched him walk to his old pickup truck. He didn't ask for anything, didn't expect anything. He'd loved me for 45 years without asking for a single thing in return. I stood there until his taillights disappeared down the driveway. Then I looked back at the mansion, my mansion, where the party was dissolving into chaos. I had 72 hours to figure out what came next. For the first time in my life, that future was mine to decide. 72 hours. That's all the time I gave them. On Monday morning, November 21st, 2024, at exactly 9 o'clock, A moving truck pulled up to 847 Ocean View Drive. Thomas Hartley stood beside me on the front steps with 2 police officers and a locksmith. Richard emerged from the house carrying a single suitcase. His face was gray. He'd aged 10 years in 3 days. The confident businessman who'd humiliated me on Friday night was gone. In his place stood an elderly man who'd just realized he'd been living on borrowed power his entire life. "Linda, please," he tried one last time. "We can work this out. Mediation? Counseling? 45 years? 45 years of you treating me like property," I interrupted calmly. 45 years of you using my money while telling everyone you were the provider. 45 years of me protecting a lie. I met his eyes. "I'm done protecting lies, Richard." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. What could he say? Thomas had spent the weekend showing him document after document. Every bank account, every property deed, every share certificate, all in my name. All protected by Charles Montgomery Sr. before his death. Richard's empire had been mine all along. The moving truck loaded his belongings, surprisingly few after 45 years of marriage. Clothes, some books, his golf clubs. Nothing else belonged to him. Devin arrived as the truck was leaving. He'd been staying at a hotel since Friday. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from alcohol or crying, I couldn't tell. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please don't do this. I'm sorry. We're sorry. Friday night was... we didn't know." "You knew enough," I said quietly. "You knew your father was humiliating me publicly. You applauded. You mocked me. That tells me everything I need to know about the man you've become." "But we're your sons." "Yes, you are, and I love you. But love doesn't mean accepting cruelty. Love doesn't mean letting you treat me like I'm worthless." I paused. "Your father taught you that power and money matter more than respect. I enabled that by staying silent. That stops now." Devin's face twisted with anger. "You're doing this for revenge. You're punishing us because..." "No, baby. I'm freeing you. You've spent 44 years living a lie. Now you get to decide who you really are. Without the Montgomery name. Without the money. Without the status. Just you. Devin. Who is that man?" He stared at me, then turned and walked away without another word. Brandon never came. I learned later he'd driven to Atlanta the morning after the party. Running from the truth. By noon, the locks were changed. The house was mine. Truly mine. And I stood in the empty hallway, surrounded by 45 years of memories, and felt nothing. Just emptiness, and space to finally breathe. 6 months later. The cottage was small, just 200 square feet, 53 miles north of Charleston, near the coast. I'd bought it for cash, $247,000 from the sale of some Montgomery Development shares. I sold the mansion in March for $18.3 million. Half went to establishing the Charles Montgomery Foundation for Domestic Violence Survivors. The other half secured my future and gave me freedom to live simply. This cottage had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a porch that faced the ocean. The garden was wild and overgrown when I bought it. Now, in May, roses bloomed everywhere. Vegetables grew in neat rows. James had helped me plant them. I sat on that porch every morning at 6:30, drinking coffee, watching the sunrise. My hair was natural now, a silver-gray afro that I'd stopped straightening in December. I wore jeans and flannel shirts instead of designer dresses. My hands had dirt under the nails from gardening. I looked like myself for the first time in 45 years. James visited twice a week, usually Wednesday afternoons and Saturday mornings. He'd work in the garden, fix whatever needed fixing. Then we'd have tea on the porch. We talked about books, about the ocean, about the birds that visited the feeders. We didn't talk about the past much. We were too busy building a present. "Do you miss it?" James asked one Wednesday in early May, wiping dirt from his hands. "The big house, the parties, the life." "No," I answered honestly. "I miss my sons. I grieve for them every day. But that life? That was never really mine. I was just playing a role. And now? Now I'm Linda. Just Linda, 65 years old, growing tomatoes, reading poetry, helping at the women's shelter 3 days a week, sleeping peacefully at night. He smiled. Sounds like a good life. It is. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the waves. James hadn't pushed for anything more than friendship. He'd told me on that first visit to the cottage in December, "Linda, I waited 45 years. I can wait another 45 if that's what you need. I'm just glad you're free." And I was learning to be free, learning to make decisions for myself, learning that I didn't need to be anyone's wife or mother or symbol. I could just be. Then, on a Saturday morning in late May, a car pulled into my driveway. Brandon. I hadn't seen him since the night of the party. 6 months of silence. I'd sent him care packages at his Atlanta address, cookies, books, a warm scarf for winter. Never with a note, just letting him know I was thinking of him. He sat in his car for a full 5 minutes before getting out. When he did, I saw how much he'd changed. He'd lost weight. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a plain button-down shirt. His face looked older, but somehow clearer. "Mom," he said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps. "Can we talk?" I set down my coffee cup. "Of course." He climbed the steps slowly, like a man approaching a judge for sentencing. He sat in the chair across from mine, James's usual chair. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I've been in therapy," Brandon finally said. 3 times a week since January, working through everything. "That's good, Brandon. I came to apologize." He looked at his hands. "What I said that night, what I did, applauding while Dad humiliated you, calling you a diversity hire. Mom, his voice cracked. "I was cruel. I was so goddamn cruel." "Yes, you were." He flinched at my honesty, but didn't argue. "I've spent 6 months trying to understand why I became so hateful. And I realized I learned it from Dad, from watching how he treated you, from absorbing this idea that money and status were the only things that mattered. I enabled that," I said quietly, "by staying silent, by accepting abuse, by teaching you that women, that I, deserve to be treated that way." "No, Mom, you were trying to protect us. I understand that now. You stayed in hell to give us a safe home. And we repaid you by becoming versions of the man who hurt you." Tears ran down his face. "I'm ashamed. Every single day I'm ashamed." I felt my own tears starting, but I blinked them back. "Brandon, baby, what do you want?" "I want to know my father, my real father." He looked up at me. Would James want to meet me?" The tears came then. I couldn't stop them. "He's been waiting 42 years for you to ask that question," I whispered. 2 weeks later, I arranged dinner at the cottage. Simple food, grilled fish, rice, vegetables from the garden. James arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, nervous as a teenager on a first date. Brandon arrived at 6:15. They stood in my small living room, father and biological son, seeing each other clearly for the first time. "Hello, Brandon," James said quietly. "Hi, James. Or should I don't know what to call you." "James is fine, for now. We'll figure the rest out as we go." They sat at my small kitchen table. Awkward at first, but slowly they started talking. James told stories about his life. Growing up poor in rural South Carolina, working his way through community college, falling in love with a girl named Linda Washington who worked in the campus cafeteria, losing her to a man who could give her things James never could, building a small landscaping business from nothing, never marrying because I already gave my heart away once, couldn't do it again. Brandon shared his life, the pressure of being a Montgomery, the constant feeling of not fitting in at country club events where he was always Richard's black son, the emptiness of chasing status, his recent work starting a small garden design business in Atlanta, inspired by old photos of James he'd found online. "I have your eyes," Brandon said suddenly. Devin always said we didn't look like Dad. Now I know why. You have your mother's strength, James replied. That's worth more than eyes. At the end of the evening, as Brandon was leaving, he paused at the door. James, would it be okay if I came back? Maybe we could have dinner again next week? James's smile was like sunrise. I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much. They hugged. A tentative, careful embrace. The first of many to come. After Brandon left, James and I sat on the porch in the darkness. Thank you, he said softly, for giving me this chance. You gave me 45 years of patient love, I replied. This is the least I could do. What about Devin? I sighed. No word. Thomas told me he's still in Charleston, working some sales job, struggling, drinking. He calls me sometimes when he's drunk, angry calls, blaming me for ruining his life. That's hard. Yes. But I can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. I send him care packages. I let him know I love him, but I can't force him to heal. James took my hand for the first time, just held it gently on the armrest between our chairs. Is this okay? He asked. Yes, I whispered. It's okay. We sat like that, holding hands, watching the stars come out over the ocean. Thanksgiving morning, not at a mansion, not with 150 guests, just here in my small cottage with the people who mattered. James was in the kitchen, making his grandmother's cornbread dressing. Brandon was setting the table, and in the living room, playing with wooden blocks, was my grandson, Brandon's son, 4-year-old Charles James Rodriguez. CJ, we called him, named for both grandfathers. CJ had been born before the party, but Brandon had kept his family away from the Montgomery toxicity. Now, finally, he felt safe bringing them into my life, the one who'd protected me in death, and the one who'd loved me in silence for 45 years. Brandon's wife, Sophia, was helping me with the sweet potatoes. She was kind and smart, and she'd helped Brandon through his darkest months in therapy. Mrs. Montgomery, Sophia started. Linda, I corrected gently. Just Linda, she smiled. Linda, thank you for including us today. Brandon talks about these dinners all the time, how much they mean to him. I looked through the doorway at my son, laughing as CJ knocked over his carefully built block tower. Brandon looked lighter now, freer, like he'd put down a weight he'd been carrying his whole life. He's welcome here any time, I said. You all are. This is what family should be. People who choose to love each other, not people trapped by obligation. The phone rang. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up. Mom? Devin's voice. Sober for once. I know you're probably having dinner. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. And could I maybe come visit sometime? I'm not ready for big family dinners yet. But maybe coffee, just us? My heart cracked open. Yes, baby, anytime. Just call me, I'll be here. I love you, Mom. I love you too, Devin. When I hung up, James was standing in the doorway, flour on his hands, hope in his eyes. He called? He called. We gathered around the small table, 7 of us in a space meant for 4, cramped and perfect. Before we ate, Brandon asked, Mom, would you say grace? I held James's hand on one side, CJ's tiny hand on the other, and spoke from my heart. I'm grateful for this moment, for this family we're building, for second chances and hard truths, for the courage to choose freedom over comfort and love over fear, for 65 years of life, and for however many years I have left to live honestly. Amen, they all said. As we ate and laughed and CJ threw mashed potatoes on the floor, I caught James watching me with those steady amber eyes. What? I asked. I'm just thinking, he said softly. 45 years ago, I lost you to fear and circumstances. Today I'm sitting at your table eating Thanksgiving dinner with our son and grandson. Life is strange, Linda. Strange and beautiful, I agreed. After everyone left and the dishes were washed, I sat alone on my porch with a cup of tea. The November wind was cold, but I'd wrapped myself in a quilt James had given me for my birthday. I thought about Richard. I'd heard through Thomas that he was living in a modest apartment, working as a consultant, humbled but surviving. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just relief that he no longer had power over me. I thought about Devin, taking his first steps toward healing. Brandon, building a life based on truth instead of lies. CJ, who would grow up knowing his real grandfather, learning that love matters more than status. And I thought about myself. Linda Washington Montgomery, 65 years old, survivor of domestic abuse, keeper of secrets, and finally a free woman. People ask me if I regret those 45 years. The honest answer is complicated. I regret the abuse I endured. I regret teaching my sons the wrong lessons by staying silent. I regret the girl I was, Linda Washington, who loved poetry and dreamed of teaching, who died in 1979. But I don't regret my sons, even with all their flaws. I don't regret the strength I found in my darkest moments. I don't regret learning, at 65, that it's never too late to choose yourself. I learned that silence protects abusers, not victims. That financial security means nothing if you've sold your soul for it. That the Montgomery name I'd worn like armor was really a cage. I learned that love doesn't demand sacrifice of your entire self. Real love, the kind James offered, is patient and kind and allows you room to breathe. Most importantly, I learned this. At 65, I finally understand that the greatest victory isn't revenge or wealth or proving people wrong. The greatest victory is waking up in the morning and recognizing yourself in the mirror. The greatest victory is peace. I finished my tea as the stars came out over the ocean. Tomorrow, James would come by to help me plant winter vegetables. Brandon would call to tell me about CJ's latest words. Devin might text, or he might not, and that would be okay too. My life wasn't perfect. It wasn't dramatic or impressive. I lived in a small cottage, grew my own food, and spent my days helping other women escape the kinds of situations I'd endured. But it was mine. Truly, completely mine. And that was worth more than any mansion, any name, any lie I'd ever lived. I stood up, folded my quilt, and walked inside. Through the window I could see James's truck pulling into the driveway. He'd forgotten his phone and was coming back for it. I smiled and opened the door. "Forgot something?" I called out. "Actually," he said, climbing the porch steps, "I was hoping I could stay for another cup of tea, if that's all right." "James Patterson, you can stay as long as you like." We went inside together, two people in their 60s, finally living the life we should have had 45 years ago. Sometimes the ending isn't the fairy tale you imagined. Sometimes it's quieter, smaller, simpler. Sometimes it's just two people sitting in a small kitchen, drinking tea and being exactly who they are. And sometimes that's exactly enough.